Hello and welcome to ThePrint. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor. And now, of course, with the budget coming up, and even apart from that, there's a lot of interest in the economy and what's been happening with it. The government recently came out with its first advanced estimates for this financial year, and so there's a lot of discussion on the economy. And to take that forward, I'm going to be in conversation with Mr. Soumya Kanti Ghosh. He's the Chief Economic Advisor to the State Bank of India and also a part-time member of the 16th Finance Commission. So thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now, Mr. Ghosh, starting off at the broad level, and then we can drill down a little bit. At the broad level, do you feel that the 6.4% growth that the government has estimated for the current financial year, do you think that that is where it's going to end up, or do you feel that they've underestimated or overestimated growth for the year?
Yeah, thank you. Let me, before I answer this question, let me put it in a perspective. If we actually look into the data from 1991 till 2024, for the last 30 odd years, Indian average growth rate over many cycles has been 6.1%.
Right.
And during 2004 to 2014, I think the decade just which preceded 2014, the average growth rate was 7.2%, excluding the year of the global financial crisis. And if you actually take the average of 2014 till date, the average growth rate is 7.3%, excluding the pandemic year where we had a contraction. So that means that growth rate of 7.2% last decade, or 7.3%, which is a tad over 7.2%. That's the aspiration which we have been looking into for the current generation. So when the NSO had actually announced a growth rate of 6.4%, the RBI is at 6.6%. So that has to be taken from that perspective. So from an aspiration of say 6.5 to 7%, I'll call it 7%. We have actually moved down to the range between 6 to 6.5%. So from that point of view, I think it's a disappointment. But in the same manner, I would like to point out that India still remains a very promising growth story. Even if we grow, the IMF recently projected the growth rate to be 6.5% for the next couple of years. Even at 6.5%, which we can all argue that that may not be significantly adequate given our aspirations, our aims, and the things which we are doing, but it's still a pretty good number. But obviously, we need to go above that. So from that perspective, I think 6.4% needs to be looked into.
Okay, so now speaking about how we can go above that growth rate, of the various drivers of economic growth, you have consumption, investment, government spending, and exports. In that, consumption is right now being largely driven by rural consumption. Urban consumption seems to be a little down. Private investment seems to be happening, but it's not happening with the kind of enthusiasm that the economy needs. Government spending this year, government capex, has been lower than what even they have projected. And exports seem to be dependent largely on services rather than merchandise. So, going ahead, which of these engines do you think are going to fire?
See, if I let me come to some of the engines which we are talking about, let me talk about consumption first. I think consumption, the good thing is that in the last CSO data, the consumption growth rate has been pegged at over 7%. This comes against the around 4% growth rate last time. So obviously that's a matter of encouragement. So that's point number one. And on consumption, you are rightly saying, you are correct when you say that the rural consumption has been buoyant. Urban consumption has somehow not kept pace with the rural consumption. But the point to note over here is that I think I will just give an example. I think what is happening currently is that because of the several initiatives the government has taken at the bottom of the pyramid for providing free foods, for providing this housing, for providing the housing, then free food, and all these, a lot of other initiatives the government is giving, what it is making is that it is making the consumption more broad-based over a point of time, and it is making it more inclusive. So the point which I'm trying to say is that the pie is actually getting enlarged. So from 100, we are moving to 105. But a large part of it's happening also because those at the bottom of the pyramid are getting empowered. But at the end of the day, given that their consumption is not significantly high as compared to the upper sections of the society. So therefore, it is taking time for the consumption growth rate to show a larger momentum. Obviously, I think if a large number of people who are at the bottom of the pyramid consume something, that is going to have a slow impact on the overall consumption rather than a rapid impact if the upper echelons take the same food on a sustained basis. So that's actually the problem. That's actually the statistical reason why consumption has been not growing so fast. So that is the first thing. The second thing is that regarding the investment pattern, I think in investment, what is happening is that yes, the government has taken a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the investment the pattern. But if you look into the corporate investment, I think corporate investment has picked up after the pandemic. This year, the final investment data will be released at the end of February. I think the investment rate could be anywhere between 33 to 33.5%. And I think that's a healthy number. May not be as significantly healthy as we used to see after in the 2011-12 when it was around 37-38%. But of course, it's a very good number, and it has improved significantly from the pre-pandemic lows. In the private, now regarding the private investment, what is happening is that investment actually has been happening in newest sectors. For example, it is happening in sectors like renewables. It is happening in sectors like solar. It is happening in sectors like non-conventional energy sources, in healthcare. So all these sectors where investment is actually happening. These are aviation also is also happening, and pharmaceuticals. So all these sectors where it is healthcare, all the sector where it is happening is basically a newest sector. So it will obviously take time to get reflected on the ground. So for example, recently the government has taken an initiative of providing solar rooftop panels across all residential houses. This is a very ambitious project, but the impact of it in terms of the overall investment requirement or anything like that will take time. So overall, as you also see, is that the private investment outlook remains bright, but the impact on the ground, since it is a little bit also being tilted to the non-traditional sectors, it will take a little bit time to move up. And finally, on the manufacturing part, I think the objective of this government is to take the share of the manufacturing to around 25%. We have moved up to close to around 17 to 18% as of now. So the government has taken a lot of initiatives in the PLI, and it has also taken some employment incentive schemes in the last budget. Hopefully, I think, and with a little bit of tweak all these incentive schemes in the forthcoming budget, I think this manufacturing sector will get a boost. So the point over here I want to mention is that it's a work in progress, which is happening on the investment front. And as far as the exports are concerned, yes, you are correct that the exports have been driven significantly by the service exports, but there are also a significant achievement because in the last 2 years, given the geopolitical uncertainty, oil hovering around 90, sometimes crossing to 95, currently it is 80, and with so much amount of volatility, and our current account deficit has still remained anchored at between 1 to 1.5%, and that's actually a significant achievement and a service exports credit, and the credit should go to the service exports. So from that point of view, while it is important to appreciate the fact that the service exports may be growing much faster than the goods export, but it's also that at the end of the day, all it does is that have a sobering impact on the Indian external sector, and the external sector numbers look healthy. And I believe that regarding the goods exports, the government is actually exploring several options in getting into some free trade agreements, which could bolster the overall export growth. And our sense is that over a point of time, as the new US president takes over, is taking over today, I think as we move over time, I think this somehow slowdown in exports is going to be a temporary blip, and it will catch up over a point of time, because you must remember that we have moved to exports. The total overall service and goods exports today is actually more than 800 billion. The target is actually 1 trillion by the end of this. I think the trade was in the next, by 2030, we should be able to reach the target much earlier than 2030 in terms of the overall goods and services exports reaching 1 trillion.
Okay, fantastic. So, but you do mention President Trump taking over. Now, one of the things that he said is that he's going to impose quite a lot of tariffs on China, and the fear then is that China is going to reroute a lot of its supplies, and some of that is already happening. that this a lot of it is going to come to India and to other countries. So how do we balance that, where we are trying to export more, but our imports are also going to increase because China is simply going to undercut our domestic producers?
No, that's a fair point. I think the problem, that's why I think the recent volatility of the exchange rate bears testimony to that, because what China does is that last time when tariffs were imposed on China, what it did is China depreciated currency, exported it goods to Vietnam, and from Vietnam it went to USA. So that was the option which the China did last year, and there are studies which shows that if the China depreciates its currency by 9%, there will be an increase in the Chinese exports by 10%. But if the same amount of tariffs are imposed, Chinese exports will be down by 25%. So obviously, China will use this one depreciation as a route. But
Mhm.
as you speak today, and I give a, so that will have an impact on the rupee exchange rate. So I think rupee has already depreciated beyond 86. But let me give you an example. I think since you mentioned this point on the rupee, and that could actually answer a lot of queries on the exchange rate front. The rupee
Right.
actually has depreciated by 3% from November 2024. This is perhaps the lowest across all currencies across the board. And if I look into the 2016 when Trump took over, the rupee had also depreciated by around 2% since the time, still the time when President Trump took over. And after President Trump took over, the rupee actually appreciated by 5.5% till May 2017. So if we apply a similar analogy over here, I think a 3% depreciation, a rupee actually I think it stands to gain as much of the haze regarding the tariff imposition or other things will get cleared as new President Trump takes office. So I am not so much bothered about the volatility in the value of the rupee, and the rupee actually has I don't know why there is so much fuss about the value of the rupee. There is a lot of noise going on which is unwarranted. But to put the things in proper perspective, during FY23 and FY24, the rupee has depreciated by 9.9%. So rupee has been depreciated over the last 2-3 years, and it is actually incorrect to say that the rupee started to depreciate only in the last 2 to 3 months after the new dispensation took over at RBI. So I think that's not a correct proposition, because there has been significant depreciation in the value of the rupee from FY23 and FY24 also.
Absolutely, and I read your most recent article arguing this, and in that same article, you also made an interesting point that the current depreciation is very different from what happened in the 2008 to 2013 period. You say that the distinct the reasons were different. So could you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, I think, see, one of the ways to look into whether the rupee depreciation is aligned with the macro fundamentals or is not aligned with the macro fundamentals is to look into the dollar appreciation. If the dollar appreciation is and the rupee depreciation are largely in line, or if the rupee depreciation is less than the dollar appreciation, that means that the economy is doing quite well. That's basically the hypothesis. But if the rupee depreciation is significantly higher than the dollar appreciation, that means that the not only the dollar is actually resulting in the rupee depreciation, but there are also internal factors to the economy which is leading to a fall in the rupee. Now, juxtapose this data in the current context. In the current context, in the last 3 to 4 years, the rupee has actually depreciated by around close to 18%, and the dollar appreciation also has been on the same percent. I think the numbers are around 17.4 and 17.9%. So they're almost aligned. So that means that whatever has been the weakness in the value of the rupee, it has much to do with the appreciation of the dollar. But if you look at the period after the global financial crisis, basically in the 2011-12, when India was a part of Fragile Five, the
Hmm.
dollar had appreciated by 5% and the rupee lost 48.5% of the value. So a simple comparison between that time and this time will say that yes, the rupee has also depreciated by close to 20% this year, but this is in completely in alignment with the dollar appreciation of the same magnitude. But if you go back in time, when the rupee depreciated by close to around 49%, this was 10 times higher than the appreciation in the value of the dollar, indicating the economy was in some serious trouble at that point of time.
I understand. And okay, so we've talked about private investment, we've talked about exports, but on consumption, the data is showing that over the last few years, real wage growth, that is, after factoring in inflation and all of that, it's remained largely stagnant. And so, isn't this going to be a big impediment to growing our consumption if real wages are not growing fast enough?
See, I think that's a fair point also, but there are 2 points to it. Yes, there has been the growth in the real wage rate has been a little bit muted, but and also the important factor is that the if you look into the EBITDA margins of the companies, you will find that this muted wage growth has also helped in shoring out the corporate margins. So that is there. So yes, but on the other hand, the interesting aspect is that if you look into this real wage, if you want to make a comparison of the nominal wage growth, say in the last 10 years or so, you will find that the standard deviation or the coefficient of variation, which is basically how dispersed are the values from the mean, was significantly higher in the period earlier, say maybe after the global financial crisis or in the decade of 2014 ended, even though the real wage growth rate at that point of time was positive. The coefficient of variation was significantly higher, indicating that there was a lot of dispersion around the mean value, meaning that if someone was getting some state was giving some wages, the other state was giving a completely different wages. But if you look into the current period real wage growth for the last 10 years, yes, the real wage in real terms, the number has been lower, but the coefficient of variation, which is basically the dispersion around the mean values, has been significantly on the lower side. So we have to make a choice between the volatility in the wages and the real terms. So my sense is that we need to understand that there has been a steady growth in wages, even though sometimes one can argue that the inflation has also been there. Of course, there has been inflation, but on the other hand, this has been evenly distributed across the spectrum. So from that perspective, I think the things are better today than what it was earlier. But on the issue of the real wage growth rate also, the point which I'm trying to mention is that at the end of the day, we also need to ensure that and the problem in India is always a good paying job. I have been always arguing that India actually suffers from an underemployment problem and not an unemployment problem, because you don't sometimes get the wages they deserve. So for this, all of us should be responsible, including the corporates and the others who pay our wages. So at the end of the day, if that is not growing at a significant rate, of course there will be some impact on the consumption. The point which I mentioned is that the government can only do so much as empowering them at the bottom of the pyramid, but at the end of the day, they can also do a little so much in pushing the consumption growth higher, but may not be to the extent of 7 to 8% or 10%, which one needs for the economy to fire even higher growth rate than what it is doing currently.
Okay, but speaking of wages, the government recently approved the setting up of the Eighth Pay Commission. Now, the thing is that is this the right signal to give at this time, where people are talking about real wages not growing, but the Eighth Pay Commission is only for government servants? Just as a signaling thing, do you think that this might not have been the best time?
See, the setting up of the 8th Pay Commission, in terms of the signaling, I think the setting of the 8th Pay Commission also will mean a revision in the wages of the state governments, the revision of the wages, the central government employees, the state government employees, and hopefully also on the research organization. So hopefully it will have a cascading impact on the wages across the board. So from that point of view, I think it's a good signaling device. And this government has been pretty focused on fiscal consolidation. So whatever, will be the decision in terms of the 8th Pay Commission, I think that will be also fiscally prudent. But I think that ultimately at the end of the day, you need some incentives for the wages to grow a little higher than what they're doing currently. And for us, as we said, that all of us should take the responsibility, not the government only. So the corporates also need to take the responsibility, because if you look into the corporate wage growth in the last 3 to 4 years, that has been less than 10%.
Absolutely. And now coming to the budget a little bit, does the government have the fiscal space to, say, provide a significant income tax cut? I mean, this is something that every year people ask for, but do you feel that there is some fiscal space for it?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the fiscal space, I think the government has done an admirable fiscal consolidation. It has brought down the deficit from 9.2% to less than 5% in after the pandemic. And this year, hopefully, they will hit 4.5%. I believe that in terms of the income tax, I think as a salaried middle class, all of us pay taxes, including US plus taxes. So our objective is always that if there is some amount of tax adjustment, my sense is that the scope for a significant the fiscal changes looks a little bit difficult, because there is a lot of social sector programs which are now running by the central government, by the states also, as you see, has been running. So my sense is that a significant scope for a fiscal adjustment is a little difficult, but there is always the option that the government goes government goes for fiscal consolidation, but maybe in a staggered manner. So, for example, from 4.9%, they can go to 4.7% this year or 4.5% next year. So that is one of the options, that in a situation they can actually go a little bit slow. But I am not sure how much is possible for the government in terms of the consolidation. There could be some simplifications in terms of the one. There could be some adjustments in terms of the tax at the bottom of the pyramid. I'll give an example how difficult is this job. In 2019, I remember when the government actually made income tax up to 5 lakhs free. I remember in 2019 budget, it immediately actually a lot of people went out of the tax net. And in a country where only around only 3 crore people paid taxes, which are of any significant number. So it is always going to be a difficult exercises for the government, because the government needs to also ensure that there is not too excessive tax burden on the people who pay taxes. So maybe maybe there could be some changes, but I'm not sure. How much significant changes could be brought about in the budget, given that the government has a lot of options, lot of social sector programs which the government actually runs about. What we all want is basically some ease of doing business. Maybe on that case, maybe some GST simplification over a point of time over the next 2 to 3 years, that could be the motto. Maybe some adjustments on the taxation on, say, bank deposits. For example, today the interest income on bank deposits is still taxable. So maybe some adjustment, maybe all taxes on asset classes could be made uniform. All taxes on asset classes could be taxed in the redemption basis and not on accrual basis. The sum of these changes may be done by the government, which are incrementally could be very positive and not a lot of financial stability to the banking system. But otherwise, I think, yes, there are possibility of some changes. I don't deny that, but it remains to be seen how that needs to be, how that is juxtaposed with the overall objective of fiscal consolidation of the government, which it is trying to achieve.
I understand. So, okay. So then my final question to you would be, now the budget is almost upon us. So it's pretty clear that they must have finalized most things. But what would your wish list be for budget 2025? What would you definitely like to see?
See, I think couple of things are unconventional things which I like to see. The first thing which I like to see is regarding addressing the judiciary issues, the number of pending cases in the judiciary. Some of these cases goes back to as old as 1952. So why can't there be a system? I don't know whether it is possible or not, because I am not a judge, or I am not, but just my simple sense says that if there is a policy of actually speaking to these people, some of the concerned person, and have a policy of writing of those cases which are non-criminal cases, will add a significant value from the ease of doing business. The second thing which the government can actually look into, which is very important, is the SME sector. The SME sector, the government needs to do something on addressing the delay in payments to the SME within the 45 days. Maybe announcing the separate PLI scheme for the SME sector, because SME sector is always job profile. So, but addressing the issue of delayed payments for the SME sector. Also, there could be, as I said to you, some make the tax treatment for asset classes uniform across all asset classes.
Right.
Another small important milestone which the government, apart all these things which the government could do, is basically on this issue of digital fraud. So maybe the government can look into some options to address this digital fraud. Why not have an cyber insurance product in a country like India? Because I think this is one of the issues. There are other, of course, industry issues which the government is addressing. For example, in solar sector, in other sectors where priority sector norms could be tweaked so that there is a more ease of doing business. But at the end of the day, I think the most important objective of the government is to ensure that it stays on the path of consolidation. But as I said to you, there is always an option that the consolidation is a little bit staggered, so as to give some option in terms of some tax adjustment, which will of course create a feel-good factor in the economy in these uncertain geopolitical times.
Fantastic. But on that note, thank you so much for this very, very insightful conversation. I'm sure all of our viewers would have gained a lot from it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.